The wind carried a low moan across the dry prairie, a sound that might have been mistaken for some restless spirit if not for the dust it stirred along the trail. Martha Ellison tightened the thin shawl around her shoulders, her eyes narrowing against the orange glare of the dying sun. At 30, she was older than most unmarried women in Red Hollow, though she had not always been alone. Once there had been a husband, a small farm, the promise of children. Once before, fever took him and left her clinging to a piece of land no larger than a grave. She had stayed because she knew nowhere else to go, but the town had slowly learned to stop seeing her, as though grief had cloaked her in invisibility. Even now, as she trudged the road back from the trading post, her basket near empty, no one had bothered to call a farewell. The road curved westward past the skeletal remains of cottonwoods that had died 2 summers ago, when the river first began to shrink. Water was everything in Red Hollow. Its absence turned neighbors into strangers, friends into rivals. Men guarded their wells with rifles, women prayed in churches that smelled of dust more than incense. Martha had grown skilled at rationing sips, at lying to herself that the ache in her stomach was hunger instead of thirst. Tonight as she walked, she thought only of how little she had managed to bring home: 2 stale loaves, a handful of beans, and a bar of soap she had traded for with her last spool of thread. She might have kept walking, her mind lost in the rhythm of her tired feet, if not for the sound that reached her ears, soft at first, then sharp, a whimper. Martha froze, her breath catching. There it was again, from the cluster of rocks near the ditch. Setting her basket down, she moved cautiously, every step stirring dust. Nestled between stones lay a dog, its coat matted with blood and mud, one paw bent at an unnatural angle. Its eyes met hers, yellow, feverish, but pleading. Martha's heart lurched. She had not touched another living soul in weeks, not since old Mrs. Kendricks had stopped asking her to mend clothes. Without thinking, she knelt, whispering soothing nonsense as though to a child. The animal flinched, then relaxed when her hands brushed gently against its fur. It was thin-starved nearly as much as she was. Martha hesitated. Taking it home meant another mouth to feed, but leaving it meant abandoning the first creature that had looked at her as if she mattered in a long time. She tore a strip from her shawl, binding the wound as best she could. The dog whined but did not resist. When she tried to stand, it struggled upright too, hobbling beside her, determined not to be left behind. Martha sighed. "All right then," she murmured, though no one but the wind heard her. "Come along." The path home wound into hills that still held the memory of streams, dry beds now cracking beneath the weight of silence. Martha's cabin stood on the far slope roof, sagging walls patched with boards that did not quite fit. Once flowers had lined the porch. Now only weeds grew, stubborn but colorless. She pushed open the door and let the dog limp inside. It sniffed the corners, then curled near the hearth as if it had lived there forever. Martha stared at it, bewildered by the sudden presence. Night settled with a chorus of coyotes in the distance. Martha lit a stub of candle and sat at the table, her fingers tracing the worn wood. She could not stop glancing at the animal, half afraid it would vanish like a ghost. But it slept deeply, breathing steady as if trusting her completely. She realized with a pang that she had been waiting for such trust, though she had never dared name the longing. At dawn, Martha rose to fetch water from her shallow well. The dog followed, limping but insistent. She lowered the bucket, listening to the hollow echo before a faint splash answered. What came up barely filled half the pail, and the liquid carried a sour tang. She grimaced, pouring a small cup for herself and a bowl for the dog. It lapped eagerly, tail twitching. Martha smiled despite herself. As she carried the bucket back, she noticed something strange. The dog trotted ahead, stopping suddenly at the old fence line where her property ended. There in the dirt lay Mark's boot prints, fresh pressed deep as if by someone carrying weight. Martha frowned. No one came this way. There was nothing here worth stealing. Yet the tracks led toward the abandoned miner's shack on the ridge, a place children once dared each other to approach, but adults avoided. A shiver crawled up Martha's spine. Stories clung to that shack: men who vanished, lights at night, whispers of hidden tunnels from the old silver days. She had dismissed them as superstition, but the prints were real. The dog barked once, low and insistent, then limped toward the ridge. Martha hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. She should turn back, forget she ever saw. But then she thought of how the town ignored her, how silence had defined her life for too long. Perhaps that was why she followed. The climb was steep, dust crumbling beneath her boots, but the dog pressed on with surprising determination. At the shack, its broken door hung crooked, one hinge squealing when the wind shifted. Martha's pulse quickened. She pushed the door with the edge of her foot. It creaked open to reveal shadows and the smell of damp earth, strange in a land so dry. Inside, the dog padded straight to the corner where a stack of boards lay piled. It scratched, whining. Martha knelt, tugging the boards aside until her hands found a trapdoor edges worn smooth. Her breath caught. She lifted it, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness. A draft rose from below, cool, moist, carrying a scent she had not known in months. Water. Her hands trembled. This was impossible. Yet the dog looked at her as though urging her on. Martha lit her candle stub and lowered herself into the shaft. The ladder groaned but held. At the bottom, the light revealed narrow tunnels carved into rock walls, glistening faintly. And there a thin stream trickled across the floor, vanishing into a deeper channel. Martha fell to her knees, cupping the water to her lips. It was clear, sweet, alive. Tears blurred her vision. She filled her hands again and again, drinking greedily until the ache in her throat eased. The dog lapped beside her tail, wagging weakly. For a moment, Martha felt reborn. But then the candlelight caught something else, marks on the wall. Charcoal sketches of the tunnel's notes scribbled in hurried script. Someone had mapped this place recently. Her joy curdled into dread. Whoever left those prints on her land had discovered the underground water. And if they meant to keep it secret, Red Hollow was in greater danger than the drought itself. Martha pinched the candlewick between damp fingers and forced herself to breathe slowly, calming the tremor that wanted to gallop through her bones. The sketches were crude but purposeful, arrowheads indicating direction, jagged lines for side tunnels, a series of X marks with numbers beside them. Whoever drew this had returned more than once, measuring, counting, claiming without a word to the thirsty souls above. A chill uncurled along her spine that was not from the underground air. She traced a penciled note near the nearest X, reading the scrawl aloud under her breath to steady herself. A small vein feeds into main channel to the east, pressure, good after the rain. East, toward Red Hollow's well, toward the church and the square and all the faces gone hollow with waiting. She straightened, listening. The dog's ears perked as if catching something she could not yet hear. Martha lifted the candle higher and followed the little stream to where it slid beneath a plank set across the floor like a bridge. When she crouched to peer under the wax light, found it at once a length of iron pipe, newly laid, slotted through rough holes in the rock and disappearing into the dark. It was a clean line amid primitive walls, wrong as a silk glove on a miner's hand. Someone was moving water where they wished it to go. Someone who could afford pipes. Her mouth went dry again, but not from thirst. She followed the pipe as it veered left, then down a shallow slope where the ceiling forced her to duck. The dog stayed close enough that its whiskers brushed her wrist. After 20 paces, the candle flame trembled in a stray draft and revealed a chamber with a makeshift table, a crate, a coil of rope, and a ledger bound in cracked leather. Martha's heart thudded. She set the candle on the crate and opened the book. Neat columns stared back sales dates, initials. Not saloon tallies or feed store counts. This was water by the barrel, priced like whiskey, and the buyers identified only by letters. HRT. She flipped pages with hands that remembered how to sew small, even stitches, and found a loose paper tucked near the back, a letter inked dark and confident. Mrs. Whitmore will not last through another week if we do not offer her a solution. Your man should reach out quietly at dusk. Keep him off Main Street. Use the alley behind breakers. Quote her double for the first week to ensure compliance. Our reservoir must not be discussed yet. If there are questions, say the wells in the North Fields recovered on their own. Destroy this letter. There was no signature, but below a smear of dried wax, an impression showed half-clear vein. She made out the E and the arcs of an L or I beside it. Vein. Martha knew only one vein in Red Hollow, Elias Vane, the gentleman whose polished boots never bore dust, who spoke at the church, socials of opportunity, while his eyes measured people the way a butcher measures a carcass for weight. He had arrived with the first rumors of a new spur of the railroad and soon owned the biggest warehouse half of the old breaker lot and a trembling share of the town's attention. The sheriff liked to stand beside him. The preacher thanked him by name. Martha always crossed to the other side of the square when he passed, and did not wonder why until now. Footsteps scratched in the tunnel behind her, and all the air left her lungs at once. The dog's growl rolled low enough to vibrate her palm where it rested on its ruff. Martha snapped the ledger shut and snatched the candle, killing the flame with a quick puff. Darkness fell, complete, thick, and disorienting. A man's voice floated close, muffled by the rock, but sharp with impatience. "I told you you miscounted Finn. If there is less than 30 tonight, Vane will have my hide and yours too." Another voice answered, younger, sullen. "We did what the gauge said." Maybe the flow slowed after the morning draw. Boots scuffed. Metal clinked. Martha's fingers closed around the ledger in the dark. She could not fight two men. She could not run past them without light. The dog pressed into her leg, silent now as if it too understood the shape of the danger. She groped for the crate, slid the ledger down her bodice against her ribs, where the stiff cover bit her skin, and lowered herself into the tight black curve behind the table, where shadows would be thickest even if someone struck a match. When she crouched there, she felt a draft on her cheek, a seam of cooler air where the wall did not quite meet itself. A fissure. She barely fit, but when she turned her shoulders sideways and pushed, rock scraped her sleeve and then gave. The dog followed with a small huff. They were in some side slit, a crack in the earth that a bigger man would not notice except as a nuisance. Light flared in the chamber as a match rasped and blossomed. Martha flattened into the crevice hard, a hammer on an anvil. The men entered, one setting a lantern on the table. In the shaky glow, she saw a narrow face with a scar along the jaw and a hat pulled low fin. The other was heavier coat, too fine for the tunnel's badge, glinting under the lapel where he had tucked it out of sight. Sheriff Rourke. Bile rose at the back of her throat. The sheriff reached for the ledger where it had been and frowned when his hand found empty wood. "You left it," Finn said, defensive. Rourke glared. "I do not leave rope for necks where anyone might grab them. It was here." They searched quick and thorough, lantern swinging. Martha did not breathe when his light dragged across the wall near her cheek. Dust tickled her nose. She prayed to no particular god. The dog's body went rigid under her fingers at a beetle's skitter. Minutes stretched thin as silk. Finally, Rourke cursed and snapped the ledger's absence into a new instruction. "We will tell Vane it was damp," and the ink ran. "No more writing. From now on, memorize tallies only." He leaned over the ledger place and sniffed at the air as if he could smell betrayal. "When we draw at dawn, take the sideline toward the Whitmore tract. If her girl faints again, the council will beg for help. Vane will arrive with barrels and blessings." Finn swallowed. "And the town well." A smile slanted across Rourke's face. Wolfish and bored both let it gasp. A thirsty man pays better than a satisfied one. They left with the lantern, taking the light with them. Martha counted to 100 and then again before she allowed her arms to shake. When she crawled out, she relit her candle with a trembling match and looked at the table to be sure she had not imagined it. The ledger's outline remained faint where dust had settled around it over days. She touched the ghost rectangle as if to promise it and herself that she would not be the sort of woman who discovered a thing and then put it back. She climbed the ladder with the dog ahead of her, pushing the trap door open an inch at a time to listen. The shack groaned its old complaint and nothing more. Outside, the sun had not risen far. A thin band of gold bled along the eastern ridge. Martha stepped into the pallid morning, carrying a secret larger than her cabin and more dangerous than hunger. On the trail down, every sound seemed multiplied, a hawk's cry. A lizard scraped the clink of stones under her boots, as if the earth wanted to announce her to anyone listening. At her fence line, she hesitated, scanning the slope toward Red Hollow. Two riders cut across the lower field silhouettes against the light, trotting toward town with that easy arrogance men wear when they are sure no one dares question them. Even at distance, the set of the shoulders read like a name. Rourke and someone in a clean coat that caught the sun too willingly. Vane liked his cloth to speak first. Martha ducked into the cabin and barred the door. The dog sat and panted tongue, lolling eyes bright with a vitality she had not seen yesterday. She poured the last of the morning water into a dish and watched its brief gleam. Then she set the ledger on the table and opened it again this time. Not as a frightened thief, but as a woman taking account. Names could be hidden in initials, but amounts told their own plain truth. If she brought this to the council as it was, Rourke would laugh and call her bitter and half mad. If she brought it to the preacher, he would ask where she had been, who had led her there, and whether she was tempting men into gossip. If she brought it to Mrs. Whitmore, there would be grief and maybe fury, and fury against men who worked in shadows, could break nothing but the one who carried it. She rubbed her temples, and the old habit of careful thought returned. The way mending had once returned her hands to steadiness after a fit of tears. She needed more than a ledger. She needed to show the water itself, its path like a black snake under the earth, the pipe, the table, the marks. She needed a witness who was neither eager to be bought nor easy to dismiss. She needed, perhaps for the first time in her life, to ask someone for help. The dog gazed at her as if it knew she had come to the edge of that admission. She scratched its ear and found a collar under the matted fur, stiff leather, with cracked gold letters, barely legible Bryn. Then a last name rubbed to obscurity by years and weather. Bryn. It suited. She whispered it, and the dog's tail thumped the floor twice. By midday, Martha had wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and stitched it into the lining of her old Sunday dress, where no search by a man in a hurry would find it. She braided her hair tight, tugged on boots she saved for town, and tucked a stub of candle and 2 matches into her pocket, along with a tin of charcoal she used to mark seams on fabric before she cut. Bryn watched her gather herself without moving from the door, then stood when she reached for the latch, as if to say he had already chosen where to go. They took the back path toward the schoolhouse to avoid the square. Children's voices rose on the air like birds startled from scrub, bright and free in a way that made Martha's ribs ache. She veered toward the clapboard building because an idea had arrived with those voices that felt both foolish and exactly right. The teacher, Miss Adeline Clay, had come to Red Hollow 2 years ago, with a trunk full of books and a mouth ready to tell men twice her size to sit down if they interrupted a lesson. She boarded with the widow harness and attended no socials where Vane liked to be admired. She was sharp enough to see and young enough to believe seeing might matter. Martha knocked at the side door between lessons, catching Adeline as she poured water for the little ones from a crock that would be empty by afternoon. Surprise crossed the teacher's face, then kindness. "Martha," she said softly, as if the name were an invitation to step in out of weather. "What can I do for you?" Martha set the empty cup she had carried for the look of ordinary errands on the counter and lowered her voice. "I need your eyes on something no one is meant to see. And if your eyes tell you I am not mad, I will ask you to walk with me into a place where men have decided we do not belong." Adeline's hand stilled on the ladle. She glanced toward the open door, where childish laughter rioted across yard dust, then back to Martha's face. "All right," she said after one heartbeat and then another to make the choice complete. "Tell me where and how fast we must go." Martha exhaled for the first time since the tunnel and felt the air reach places that had been clenched since the river began to shrink. She did not smile, but something inside her unclenched just enough to make a promise. "Yes," she thought, laying a palm on Bryn's head. "Now we begin to make this visible." Adeline dismissed her class early with the excuse of a sudden headache. Though Martha could see the calculation in her eyes, she knew that once the children ran free into the yard, no parent would fault her for a shortened day. The 2 women waited until the last child scampered down the lane before slipping out the side door together. Bryn padded behind them, limping only slightly, his nose testing every eddy of the dry wind. Martha carried the oil-clothed bundle pressed close against her ribs, as though the ledger itself could betray them if left to hang loosely at her side. They kept to narrow alleys weaving between sheds and empty corrals, avoiding the square where Sheriff Rourke's office stood, with its porch sagging under the weight of law's pretense. Adeline walked quickly, skirts brushing dust, her brow set in a line that belonged more to a soldier than a schoolteacher. Martha found herself glancing sideways, wondering at the courage that lived inside this young woman. She had thought of herself as too timid, too worn until last night, but now here was another who did not flinch at stepping into shadows. At the ridge, Martha led her toward the shack. Adeline's face hardened when she saw the boot tracks near the door, half erased by morning wind. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of tobacco and damp earth. Martha pulled the trap door open, holding the candle high as she descended Adeline. following with determined hands on the ladder's rails. Bryn scrambled awkwardly but refused to be left behind. In the chamber, Martha relit the candle and pressed it toward the pipe gleaming against the rock. Adeline bent close fingers, brushing the iron. Her eyes widened. "This isn't miner's work," she whispered. "This is recent, deliberate." She knelt at the stream, letting water slick her fingertips, then lifted them to her lips. Clear, sweet. She closed her eyes as if tasting both relief and fury in the same breath. Martha tugged the ledger free and placed it on the crate. Adeline read quickly, her lips moving silently, her face growing paler with every page. When she finished, she shut the book gently, as though afraid it might crumble. "You understand what this means?" she asked. Martha nodded. "It means they've been bleeding the land while we prayed for clouds." For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the trickle of water and Bryn's steady panting. Then Adeline said, "We need witnesses, not just us. The council, maybe even the ranchers, who still have sway. If we bring this to the open with only our voices, Rourke will call us liars. If we bring it with more, with proof in hand, he cannot so easily smother it." Martha's stomach twisted at the thought of standing in the square, speaking words that might paint a target on her back. But the memory of the sheriff's voice, smooth with cruelty, urged her forward. "Who do we trust?" she asked. Adeline considered. Clara Whitmore, certainly. The woman's word carries weight, and she's already lost kin to thirst. And perhaps Jacob Harrow, though he is stubborn, he hates being cheated worse than he hates drought. They plotted in low tones, planning which path to take and when. Martha felt her pulse quicken at the risk, but also something warmer, purpose. When at last they climbed from the shack and sealed the trapdoor again, the sun was already sliding west. They reached town just as the bell tolled for evening prayer. Martha clutched the ledger tight beneath her shawl, while Adeline slipped into the church to whisper hurriedly to Clara. The widow's sharp eyes met Martha's from across the pews, and for the first time Martha did not look away. Clara inclined her head, once curt and sure. But fate did not grant them secrecy for long. As they stepped back into the dusty street, Sheriff Rourke leaned against a post, his badge half hidden under his coat, his smile sharp. "Ladies," he drawled. Out for a stroll, so late his gaze flicked to Martha's shawl, lingering as though he could sense the weight of the ledger beneath. Adeline's chin lifted. "Just escorting Mrs. Ellison home, Sheriff." The night air helps clear my thoughts. Rourke's eyes narrowed, amusement and suspicion mingling. "Be careful then. The roads aren't safe for women alone. Too many stray dogs about." Bryn growled, low, teeth bared. Rourke's smile thinned. He tipped his hat mockingly and sauntered away toward the saloon, spurs jangling. Martha's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to keep walking until they reached the dim safety of her cabin. Inside, they bolted the door. Adeline set her hand on Martha's arm. "Tomorrow," she said, "we gather those we trust and bring this into the light. Tonight, guard it with your life." Martha sank into the chair, the ledger heavy against her ribs, Bryn curling at her feet like a shadow. The dog's steady breathing filled the silence as stars prickled the sky outside. She had always thought herself invisible, but now she knew too well that unseen eyes already watched her. Tomorrow she would have to step into sight, not for herself, but for the whole of Red Hollow. Yet as sleep tugged at her, she could not help the whisper that escaped her lips, directed at the faithful creature who had led her here. "We may have woken something too big for us, Bryn." The dog only thumped his tail once, as if to say he had known that all along. Martha did not sleep long. The night carried too many sounds. The scuff of boots on the road, the echo of a wagon wheel rattling past the coyote's sharp cry, answered by a dozen others on the ridges. Each noise tore her back from slumber until she sat upright at the table, the ledger open before her, the candle guttering low. Bryn stirred and pressed his muzzle against her knee, as if reminding her that dawn was only hours away. She ran her fingers over the careful columns once more, anger stiffening her spine. Every entry was another child fainting in the schoolyard, another mother carrying an empty bucket from a dry well, another old man coughing in the dust. When the first pale light edged through the shutters, Martha wrapped the ledger in fresh oilcloth and tucked it deep into her basket beneath a layer of beans. Adeline returned just after sunrise. Her hair hastily pinned, her eyes fierce despite the shadows under them. She had spoken to Clara Whitmore and Jacob Harrow in the early hours, she said, and both agreed to meet at the schoolhouse before noon. Clara would bring two councilman men, not easily swayed by Rourke's badge or Vane's money. Jacob would bring his brother, a rancher, known for his stubborn honesty. They left Martha's cabin by the back trail, Bryn trotting beside them with renewed energy. The town seemed quieter than usual, too quiet as though the streets themselves held their breath. At the schoolhouse, sunlight slanted across the worn benches, where the chosen few already waited. Clara Whitmore stood at the front, her figure straight as a lance, gray hair bound tightly. Jacob Harrow sat stiff, backed arms, folded, his brother beside him, with suspicion carved deep into his brow. The two councilmen shifted uneasily, but nodded greetings. Martha's throat tightened, but Adeline stepped forward with calm authority. She spoke of the hidden tunnel, the pipe, the water flowing beneath their feet. She laid the ledger on the desk and opened it to the columns of sales and initials. Clara read aloud, her voice ringing against the wooden walls. The men leaned forward, faces hardening, as the truth became clear. Jacob slammed his fist once, rattling the ink bottle. "If this is true," he growled, "then Vane has been bleeding us dry while children faint from thirst." Before Martha could answer, the door banged open. Sheriff Rourke filled the frame, flanked by two deputies with rifles. His smile was cold as winter. "Funny thing," he drawled. "Someone said they saw a pair of women sneaking about the old shack yesterday. I thought I'd find the reason here." His gaze locked on the ledger lying open. Bryn barked, sharp and furious, the sound cracking the tension like lightning. Rourke's eyes flicked toward the dog, then back to Martha. "Hand it over," he ordered. No one moved. Clara Whitmore stepped between Martha and the sheriff, her chin raised. "This book belongs to the people of Red Hollow," she said firmly. Rourke's hand dropped to his revolver. "You're making a mistake, Clara. Vane won't forgive this, and neither will I." Jacob Harrow rose to his feet, towering, his fists clenched. The councilmen shifted uneasily, but neither stepped back. The air inside the schoolhouse grew heavy, each heartbeat louder than the last. Martha felt Adeline's hand brush her, steadying. She drew a breath that tasted of dust and resolve. Then she spoke, her voice shaking, but clear enough to carry. "We know about the reservoir. We know about the pipes. We know you've been selling water in secret while our wells ran dry." Gasps rippled through the small gathering. The deputies glanced at each other, doubt flickering in their eyes. Rourke's face darkened. "Lies," he snapped. The word rang false even to his own men. Clara lifted the ledger high so the sunlight caught its pages. Not lies. Proof. Silence pressed down thick and suffocating. Then Jacob's brother spat into the dirt floor. "You've bled us long enough, Sheriff." His words broke the tension. The deputies lowered their rifles, uncertain. Rourke cursed and backed a step, but the ground beneath him was already shifting. Martha felt the moment like a gust of wind at her back, the turn of power, fragile but real. She tightened her grip on the basket and met Rourke's eyes without flinching. "You can't bury water," she said. "Sooner or later, it always rises." For the first time, the sheriff's composure cracked. Rage twisted his features, but fear threaded through it too. He shoved the door wide and stormed out, his spurs jangling like broken chains. The deputies hesitated, then followed, leaving the room humming with new breath. Clara closed the ledger and placed it gently on the desk. "The council must hear this at once," she declared. "We'll call the town together by sundown. Martha, you've given us the key." Martha sagged into the nearest bench, Bryn pressing against her legs, his tail sweeping the floor in slow, steady strokes. For the first time in years, eyes turned toward her, not with pity or dismissal, but with something sharper: respect, expectation, hope. She swallowed hard, realizing the weight that now rested on her shoulders. Outside, church bells rang their sound, carrying clear across the thirsty valley. Red Hollow was stirring, and the day ahead would decide if it rose in unity or collapsed under the sheriff's shadow. Martha glanced at Adeline, who gave her a small nod of courage, and then at Clara, whose steady gaze promised she was no longer alone. The fight was only beginning. By sundown, the whole of Red Hollow gathered in the square, drawn by whispers that moved faster than wind. Women clutched children to their skirts, men leaned on shovels and rifles, and the old pressed close with faces worn as leather. Martha stood near the front, the ledger clutched in Clara Whitmore's hands. She felt every gaze on her, though most had never spared her more than a nod in passing before this day. Bryn sat at her feet, tail sweeping dust in steady arcs, the only heartbeat she could trust to keep rhythm with her own. Clara stepped onto the steps of the church, lifting her voice above the murmur. Neighbors, we have been thirsty too long, not only from the drought, but from deceit. She held the ledger high, its pages trembling in the evening breeze. This book records the theft of our water, the sale of it behind our backs while our wells went dry. The crowd surged with gasps and curses. Jacob Harrow bellowed from the front line, "It names Clara. Tell them plain." Clara opened to the columns, reading aloud the initials and the tallies. When she reached Rourke's, the crowd roared. When she spoke Vane's name, silence fell sharp and cutting, as if the whole town had inhaled at once. Then voices rose in fury, louder than any sermon. Martha swallowed hard, her throat dry. Adeline nudged her forward. "You must speak," she whispered. "They need to hear it from you." Martha shook her head, but the crowd parted, faces turning expectant. She felt the heat of their eyes, the press of their hope. She drew a breath that scraped like sand in her lungs. "I followed a dog." She began, her voice unsteady but caring. "It led me to the shack on the ridge. Beneath it runs water, clear and sweet, piped away from us in secret. I saw the pipes, the tables, the maps. I held the proof in my own hands." The murmurs swelled, people pushing closer. She steadied herself. "Sheriff Rourke and Elias Vane have been bleeding us, selling what belongs to every one of us. While our children fainted, they filled barrels and sold them for gold." Anger burst like fire through the crowd. Fists lifted, curses spat, women wept with fury as much as relief. But the noise broke when a voice rang sharp from the edge of the square. "Lies." Every head turned. Elias Vane rode in on a glossy bay coat, immaculate. Despite the dust, his smile slick as oil. He dismounted slowly as if he owned the ground. "You'll trust the word of a widow with nothing?" He sneered, his eyes cutting to Martha. "She lives on scraps and whispers, and now you believe her tales?" Jacob Harrow stepped forward, fists tight. "We've got more than her word, Vane. We've got your ledger." Clara held it aloft, and the crowd erupted again. Vane's smile flickered but did not break. He spread his arms wide, voice smooth. "Anyone could have written that. Initials mean nothing. This is a witch hunt stirred by bitter women." The insult hit like a stone. Martha felt heat flood her cheeks, but before she could answer, Adeline's voice rang clear. "If initials mean nothing, why does your face pale when we read them?" She stepped to the front, eyes blazing. "Tell us then, Vane, why did Rourke guard your shack like a hound on a leash?" The crowd surged closer, pressing Vane into the circle of their fury. His hand twitched near his coat, where a pistol surely rested. Bryn growled, teeth flashing white in the twilight. Vane's smile curdled into a snarl. "Your children playing at justice," he spat. "Do you think you can take what's mine?" Clara's voice cut through the uproar, hard as iron. "It was never yours. It belongs to all of us." For a heartbeat, the square held its breath, the moment strung taut as a wire. Then Vane's pistol flashed. Bryn lunged, teeth sinking into his sleeve, dragging his arm aside as the shot cracked wild into the night. Chaos erupted. Men shouting, women screaming, rifles raised. Martha stumbled back, her heart hammering as Jacob and his brother surged forward, tackling Vane to the ground. The gun clattered against stone. Clara seized it and held it high. The crowd roared, the sound no longer fear but triumph. Vane struggled, cursing, but hands pinned him down, ropes binding his wrists. Martha stood trembling. Bryn pressed against her skirts, his muzzle streaked with blood, but eyes fierce. The square swam with shouts and fury, but beneath it all, a new sound began to rise. Hope, rough and ragged, but real. And as the stars blinked awake above Red Hollow, Martha knew the night had turned. The town had seen her, believed her, and together they had faced the man who would have drowned them in their own thirst. Yet she also knew it was not over. Rourke was still out there, and power never surrendered quietly. Tonight was only the first crack in the dam. The rope bit into Elias Vane's wrists as the townsfolk dragged him toward the church steps, his protest drowned by the roar of voices demanding answers. Clara Whitmore stood firm at the top of the stairs, rifle in hand, her expression carved from stone. When the crowd shoved Vane forward, she raised her palm for silence. It fell slowly, grudgingly, like embers settling after a blaze. "This man sought to sell our lives back to us," Clara declared. He thought us blind, too thirsty to see truth. But Red Hollow will not be broken. A chorus of cheers answered, but Martha noticed how Vane's smile slithered back, even as Rope cut his skin. "You fools," he hissed, his voice carrying, despite the jeers. "You think tying me up changes anything? I have friends in every office from here to the Capitol. The governor himself drinks from my table. When word reaches him, he'll send men soldiers, and they'll grind this town into dust." The councilmen exchanged uneasy glances, and for a moment doubt rippled through the crowd. Martha's chest tightened. She could see it, the creeping fear that power beyond their valley might crush them before they tasted freedom. She stepped forward before her courage could falter, Bryn at her side. "Then we'll send word first," she said louder than she thought herself capable. "We'll carry proof maps, the ledger, and witnesses to the Capitol. We'll show them who you are before you can weave your lies." Vane laughed, bitter and sharp. "Who will believe a seamstress widow and a schoolteacher?" Martha's voice shook but did not break. "They will when the whole town speaks as one." She looked out at the faces before her, roughened by dust and thirst, but shining now with anger and resolve. "You've all suffered. You've all seen wells go dry while his wagons rolled at night. Together, no governor can ignore us." Murmurs of agreement spread steadier this time. Jacob Harrow raised his fist. "She's right. We ride not just for water, but for justice." Bryn barked once sharp as a drumbeat. Clara nodded firmly. "Then it's decided. We hold Vane here under guard, and tomorrow at dawn, we send a delegation to the Capitol with this ledger in hand." Relief washed over Martha, but beneath it churned unease. The sheriff was not among them. Rourke had vanished into the shadows, and a man like him would not sit idle while his partner hung in ropes. That night the town set a watch around the church. Lanterns burned in windows that had too often been dark. Martha returned to her cabin with Adeline and Bryn, exhaustion dragging at her bones but sleep far away. She sat at the table mending a tear in her shawl, more to steady her hands than for need. Adeline poured thin tea and broke the silence. "He'll come for it, you know." Martha nodded. "The ledger, or me." Bryn lifted his head ears, twitching, a low growl rising in his chest. Outside, the wind scraped across the hills, carrying with it a promise Martha could not mistake. Rourke was still out there waiting for the dark to thicken, waiting for the moment when courage faltered. She set down her needle and looked at Adeline. "If he comes tonight, we cannot face him alone. We need the town awake." Adeline's eyes burned with quiet fire. "Then let's wake them." Together they stepped into the night, Bryn leading his limp nearly gone. Lanterns still glowed in the square shadows, shifting as men kept their vigil around Vane. Martha raised her voice, thin but fierce. "Neighbors, watch the hills. Rourke runs free, and he'll not let us rest while truth is in our hands." The crowd stirred, rifles, lifted torches, swung toward the dark ridges. Somewhere beyond sight, a horse neighed sharply, followed by the crack of a branch under weight. Martha's blood iced. The sheriff was closer than she dared imagine. And as the town rallied, pulling tighter around its own, she knew the coming hours would decide whether Red Hollow's courage held, or whether fear would scatter them like dry leaves before a storm. The storm broke just after midnight. A gunshot cracked across the ridge, echoing through the valley like thunder. Torches flared as men scrambled to the edge of town, rifles raised, eyes wide against the dark. Martha clutched Bryn's collar to keep him from bolting forward, her heart hammering so hard she thought the sheriff himself might hear it. Another shot followed, closer this time, and then a voice rolled down the slope, mocking and cold. "You think ropes and candles will save you? You think a crowd can stand against law?" It was Rourke, his words laced with fury. He knew how to strike fear, but tonight the town did not scatter. Instead, voices rose in answer, shouts of defiance, curses hurled into the night. Clara Whitmore strode into the square, rifle in her hands, her gray hair catching the torchlight. "Hold your ground," she commanded. "This is our water, our town, our lives. If he comes, he faces us all." Martha felt the air thicken with resolve. Jacob Harrow and his brother moved to the front, rifles, steady, shoulders squared. Adeline stood beside Martha, lips pressed tight, her hands clenched though she held no weapon. Bryn growled low, a steady rumble that seemed to root Martha to the earth. A shadow detached from the ridge and galloped toward the square, Rourke on horseback, his revolver glinting under the torchlight. Behind him rode 3 men deputies who had not stood down. The townsfolk surged, some ducking for cover, others lifting rifles. The square exploded with noise gunfire sparking like lightning. Martha dropped behind the water trough, dragging Adeline with her. Wood-splintered dust stung her eyes. She risked a glance. Rourke rode hard, firing into the air to scatter the crowd, his men cutting a path toward the church. Toward Vane. He means to free him. Martha realized, panic sharp in her chest. If Vane escapes with Rourke, they'll spin the story and crush us all. Bryn barked furiously and tore free of her grip, charging into the chaos. Martha lunged after him, but Adeline grabbed her wrist. "Let him go," she hissed. "He knows." Through the tangle of bodies and smoke, Martha saw Bryn leap at a deputy's horse, teeth snapping. The animal reared, throwing its rider. Townsmen seized the opening, pulling the man down, binding him fast. The fight raged, but the tide was shifting. Red Hollow was not scattering. It was standing. Rourke cursed, wheeling his horse toward the church steps. Clara raised her rifle and fired. The shot ripped through the dark, striking the sheriff's hat clean from his head. He jerked, stunned, then snarled like a cornered wolf. Martha's voice broke from her throat before she could think. "Stop him! Don't let him near Vane." Men surged to block the path, rifles cracking. Rourke fired back, one man crying out as he fell, but the others held firm. Bryn darted through the smoke, lunging at Rourke's boot teeth, sinking deep. The sheriff bellowed and kicked, but the distraction gave Jacob his chance. He swung his rifle like a club, striking Rourke square in the shoulder. The sheriff toppled from his horse, crashing to the dust. The crowd roared. Hands seized Rourke, wrestled the revolver from him, pinned him down with ropes as rough as the ones that bound Vane. His curses filled the square, venomous but powerless now. Silence followed, heavy and awed, broken only by Bryn's panting. Martha stumbled forward, her knees weak, and dropped beside the dog, running her hands over his fur. He was bleeding from a gash along his flank, but his tail wagged once defiant. Clara lowered her rifle, her voice steady though her hands shook. "The sheriff is no longer law here. He will face justice with Vane at the Capitol." The crowd erupted again, this time not with fury, but with something fiercer, triumph. For the first time in years, Martha saw her neighbors' faces lit not by fear, but by fire, by belief that they had turned the tide themselves. She lifted her head, meeting Clara's gaze across the square. "We stood," she whispered, half to herself, half to Bryn. "We truly stood." But even as the people cheered, Martha knew the hardest road lay ahead. The Capitol would not be easily swayed, and men like Vane always had deeper pockets and darker allies. Tonight was victory, but tomorrow would demand something even greater: endurance. She pressed her palm against Bryn's wound, whispering thanks, and looked out at the faces gathering close. For the first time in her life, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, necessary, bound to the fate of Red Hollow as tightly as rope to wrist, and she knew there was no turning back.